up until this point, we learned how to code specific things for the computer to follow, but we have no way of the computer to sort of make its own decisions. So in this lesson, we'll be talking about if statements, which is fundamentally the thing that allows programs to change based off of other factors, like based off of what the user does or based off of the time of day. So this is called if statements in programming, this concept of making decisions. And in Java, it looks like this. A simple if statement looks like this. You say if, and then inside you have a condition, and then inside this opening and closing bracket, you have the code that you want to run if that condition is true. For instance, you could say if the score is greater than the high score, inside here you could print out congratulations, new high score. So let's look at an example of how this works, a little bit more of a complicated example. Because in addition to just checking if something is true and then doing something, you can also say, well, if that's not true, else, if something else is true, then do this. And else, if neither of those are true, do a third thing. And you can keep adding on these else statements. So here's an example of this working with real code. And basically what this does is it looks at a percentage grade. And if that grade is greater than 96, then it will say that you have an A+. If it's not greater than 96, but it is greater than 90, oh, missing parenthesis there. If it is greater than 90, then it will say you have an A. And if it's none of those, it'll say you don't have an A. So first off, let's create an integer variable called grade. And to start off, we'll say that it's 100. And this should tell us that we have an A+. So let's run the program, and it says we have an A+. But now let's drop it down to 93. And 93 isn't 96, but it is greater or equal to 90. So let's run it, and it says we have an A. And then if we drop it to something, anything below 90, it'll say that we don't have an A. So this is a great way to run different code based off of, in this case, based off of the number grade. So now let's look at a little bit more of a complicated example. You can actually put an if statement inside of another if statement. And this is called nesting the if statements, kind of like a Russian nesting doll. So in this example, we have one if statement that goes around all of the code, and it checks to see whether the game is over, whether this variable game over is equal to true. And if the game is over, then it checks the score. And if the user scored greater than 1000, it says you won. And if the user didn't score, else if they didn't score greater than 1000, it says sorry, you lost. So this is a great way to check even more complex situations. Right here we're checking one condition, and if that's true, then we check another condition. And if it's not true, then we don't do anything because the game is still going. So let's look at this activity and try it for ourselves. In the first activity, we're asked to make a calculator. And we already made one calculator that just adds numbers, but in this one, we actually need to add multiple, or we need to do different kinds of operations. We need it to be able to do plus, minus, times, and divide. So the first step is to take some user input. So let's go over to Eclipse and delete our previous example. And we're going to start by taking user input for a number. Let's look back at this example real quick. First, it asks what operation we want to do. So I'm going to copy this prompt, and back in Eclipse we need to import the scanner to be able to take user input. Import java.util.scanner, and that should be a capital S. And then down here we'll create a scanner object. And then we can use that scanner object to take user input. So let's create a variable called operation, and it's just going to be a string variable. and we're going to set it equal to whatever the user puts in. So in this case, we're going to use my scanner dot next line. And then right before that, we need to print out the prompt. And we can just paste that in from the example in the lesson. Now let's try just running this much. So far it should ask us what operation we want to do and then let us type something in. So I'll click run, and right here you can see it asks us which operation we want to do, and it lets us type something in. But it doesn't do anything with that yet. So the next thing we need it to do is ask for our first number. So in order to do this, down here there's a little important things we need to know. One of the things is that because we're reading both these characters and we're reading numbers in, we need to use different scanner objects. It'll be simpler if we use different scanner objects, because when we try reading in these characters with the same object that's meant to read in numbers, sometimes it can get a little bit thrown off. And if you want to understand that better, you can look at this Stack Overflow post that explains why that is. But to simplify things, we're going to create a different scanner just for taking in the numbers, and I'll call this my num scanner. For taking in the numbers, and this part is all the same, so I can copy it. Okay, so next we need to print out the prompt for the first number. We want to print out, what is your first number? So we'll type system.out.println, what is your first number? And then we need to take in input using this number scanner. And so we'll make a variable. We'll say double num1 equals, and then my num scanner. And since we're taking in a double, we'll use dot next double. And now we can do the same thing to take in our input for the second number. We'll just change this to second, and we'll change this to num2. So now let's try running our code this far. First it'll ask us which operation we want to do, and when we type something in, it'll ask for our first number and for our second number, and then it stops there. So the very last thing we need to do is use our new skill of if statements to do an operation on these numbers depending which character they typed in. So we're going to need 4 different if statements. We need to say if it's a plus, then add them. And then down here we can say else if it's a different operation, then do that operation. And then we're going to need to put 2 more of these else ifs in there. That didn't line up quite right. There we go. Now I haven't actually filled in anything else, but this is what the structure is going to look like. There's 4 different possibilities. So to start off, well, first let's fix this. There we go. To start off, we need to test whether they put in a plus, a minus, a plus, a minus, a multiply sign, or a divide sign. And that's where this other important note comes in. When you're comparing 2 strings like we are here, each of these is a string, we need to use this special method called dot equals rather than using the equals sign. We use this equals sign to test if 2 numbers are equal, but it won't do the same thing for 2 strings. And I won't explain why right here, but if you want to understand a little more, you can look at this Stack Overflow post that explains why the Java developers made it that way. So right here, we're going to test whether our operation, or our operator scanner, our operation scanner right here, or sorry, the variable to which we saved the input for the operation, we're going to check whether that equals with dot equals and then a string for the plus. And now we can just copy this code into each if statement and test for each of the different operators. So we just need to change this to a minus, and this to a multiply sign, and this to the division sign. Now we just have to implement our code inside. So if the operation they wanted to do was addition, then we need to print the two numbers added together. System.out.println num1 plus num2. And then we can copy this print statement, and we can say for each of these, if they wanted to do subtraction, we can have it print num1 minus 1, 2. If they wanted to do multiplication, num1 times 1, 2. And if they wanted to do division, num1 divided by 1, 2. There, so each of those if statements should do the right thing. Let's check and see if it works. First, it asks us for our first number. Let's put in 4. Oh, sorry, I put in the wrong thing there. Let's try running this again. It asks us for the operation. Let's try addition first. Let's try adding 2 and 3. And it prints out 5. That's correct. Let's see if subtraction works. Let's run this one more time. We want to subtract, and our first number is going to be 5, and our second number 2, and 5 minus 2 is 3. Let's try multiplication. Let's try this time doing 11 times 4, and it correctly calculates 44. And lastly, just to test our division, let's try dividing 9 by 3, and it correctly guessed that it was 3. Well, it didn't guess, it calculated it. Now let's look back and make sure that we've done everything right here. Oh, the one difference is we need to print out the answer is before printing out our answer. So that's not a big deal. We can just add a print statement before the if statement. And just do one more test to make sure everything is working. Yep, perfect. Exactly like the output here in the example. Okay, let's move on to the second activity, which is something a little more related to the temperature control lab. So in this activity, we need to power on both heaters, and we need to power them on to a level input by the user. And then when both of the heaters get above 30 degrees Celsius, we need to turn on the red LED. And then when they both hit 35 degrees Celsius, we need to disconnect and shut it off. So let's look at how we can do this in Eclipse. So let's erase our example code from the last project. And the very first thing we'll need to do is we need to take in the power user or the power level that the user wants to set the heater to. So let's right here make a scanner. And then we're going to prompt the user to put in a power level, so we can print out, we'll print out, please type in a power level. And then we need to accept that as a double input. So we'll create a double variable, and we'll call that power level. And we'll say that equals our scanner dot next double. And then after we have that value, the next thing we need to do is turn on both heaters to that power level. So right here, in order to connect to the JTC lab, we're going to need to import that library. And then down here, we'll create a JTC lab object. And then right here, we can turn on both heaters. And if we look back at the example, it wants us to notify the user that the heaters are heating up. So right here, we'll print out heating up. And then we'll set both heaters to the power level that the user specified. So we can do that with mylab.q1, and then we'll set that equal to this variable power level. And then we can copy that code and paste it here. For the second heater. Okay, let's check back, or actually, let's just test that much of our code. We'll add a close statement here at the end to make sure that we disconnect from the lab. And let's test that much so far. It successfully connects. It asks us for a power level. Let's put in 60%, and it says heating up, and then it should immediately disconnect. There we go. Okay, so the next step is to do some of these conditions that we're asked to do in the exercise. So the first thing is when the temperature hits 30 degrees Celsius, we have to turn on the red LED. And the second thing is when both heaters are above 35 degrees, we have to disconnect from the lab and shut it off. So let's switch back to our Eclipse. And what we can do here is we need to keep checking until the conditions are true. So I'm just going to write a while loop, and I'm going to set the condition to true. And what this does is it'll be an infinite loop, but then inside I'll have two if statements, and when the second one is true, once we've hit, if we look back here at the exercise, once we've hit 35 degrees Celsius, I can use a command to just stop that while loop, stop whatever is happening. So the first while loop that we want to check is we want to check if both heaters are above 30 degrees Celsius. So let's go back here and we'll say if mylab T1 is greater than 30 and mylab T2 is greater than 30. And then if that's true, it asks us to turn the LED on. So we can say mylab.led and we'll set that to on. There we go. So if we run this, it should run until the lab turns on to 30 and then turn the LED on and keep running. Now, because we have a while true here, this will never actually get reached. It'll just keep running forever after that. So before we test it, let's add the second if statement that will break out of this loop. So next we want to test, let's go back to the exercise here. We want to test when both heaters are above 35 degrees. So we can just copy this and we'll write else if they're both above 35 degrees. And you know what, I just noticed one problem with the way I've done this. We'll just have to switch it around. The way that the code is written right now, it'll first check if the temperature is above 30 degrees. And if that's not true, then it'll check if it's above 35. And it's a little funny because if it's above 30 degrees, it will definitely be above 35. And because it'll only check this if it's not above 30 degrees, it's actually going to end up never checking the second statement. So we just need to switch these, and we'll put this one before this one so that first it checks if it's above the higher temperature, and then if it's not, then it'll also check if it's above the lower temperature. And then if that's true, we need to turn the LED, or rather than turn the LED off, we just need to break out of this loop. And we can do that with this simple command, break. And then after we do all of that, it should disconnect and turn off the lab. Let's go back and look at the exercise and see if we need to do anything. Oh yeah, the last thing we need to do is print out that both heaters have passed 35 degrees Celsius. So I'll write a print statement here. There we go. Now let's try running this and see if it works. I'm going to start the program. It asks for a power level. I'll put in 100. It's heating up. And I'm going to pause the video here and wait until it gets to 30 and then 35. And then I'll restart the video and we can look at how the output ended up. Okay, and you can see here that just a little while later, the program did end. Once they hit above 30 degrees Celsius, the LED turned on. And then as soon as they both got above 35 degrees Celsius, it shut off and notified us that they had passed 35 degrees Celsius. So that's the second project here for our if statements lesson. I hope you've learned something. If you have any questions, feel free to look back and review or comment them below, and we'll see you in the next lesson.